All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 87 of the PetroNerds podcast, another special treat for listeners. Today is Wednesday, June 21st, 2023. It is the longest day of the year, and we've had some awesome summer weather in Denver, so that's been exciting. But my name is Trisha Curtis. I am the host of the PetroNerds podcast. Really looking forward to you guys listening to this today. This is Liberty Frac Part 2. My special guest, Roy Aune, who's the director of research and development at Liberty Energy. So we recorded this in his offices. If you listen, you need to listen to last week's episode 86, because this is part one. This is one of the best conversations and best talks you're going to hear on frac, especially electric frac and the evolution of frac from tier 2, the engine side, from tier 2 to tier 4 to dual fuel to now with the electric frac fleets going on. So I'll recap what we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But with that being said, that was recorded on May 25th. Fantastic conversation. Reviews have really been great, folks. So with that being said, today is June 21st, 2023, and holy crap, the world, there's a lot going on in the world. If you are not paying attention to China, you're really sort of missing something. And so, I know, for clients of mine and for people who listen, I spend a lot of time working on China. The reason I'm keeping this short is for one of those reasons, because I'm spending a lot of time on the topic. So a few big headlines right now. We've got WTI at 72.53. We have recovered a little bit there. We've got Brent at 77, just over $77. Definitely some recovery there. Henry Hub at 259. Dutch TTF at 1182. We're looking at the 30-year mortgage at about 690. It has come down from those highs we saw, well over 7%, but it's still at 690. It's so really high. We will be getting into housing stuff, so some very interesting stuff going on the housing front. And the 10-year yield is at 3.7725. So, the few big things I want to cover is, the OPEC and IEA came out last week with their information. If you are feeling a little bit jarred and mixed and feel like you have whiplash with regards to oil demand and oil prices, and thinking things haven't quite matched up, and that the bulls are saying, hey, it's all going to get better in the second half, you're not the only one. This is getting really, really dicey in terms of, oh, are we going into recession? Are we not going to recession? What are oil prices actually baking in? And you have both the OPEC and IEA pretty bullish on, really just bullish on Chinese demand outlook. So they're baking in, their bullish outlooks for the second half of this year are largely premised on Chinese demand growth. Now, if you actually saw and read through in the IEA's oil market report from last month, which was released last week, it actually said that oil demand from China had really rebounded significantly, and total oil demand was over 16 million barrels a day as of late. That I have a hard time. I mean, that may be true, but that means there's other softness in the global oil market, or there's just so much supply. Otherwise, we wouldn't see this pressure on prices. We are definitely still seeing continued softness in the contracted volumes for WTI, but we're not seeing that as much for Brent. So something's out of whack here. And what I'm hearing from the bull side, from everybody who's baking on the second half recovery story, is that, oh, this is the short sellers and everything. The problem is, the reason you have short selling and the reason people bet on short selling is because they see the recession coming, and that's what they're betting on. So not saying they're necessarily right, because traders can get it wrong, but it means there's a reason they're doing this. They're not just doing it for kicks and giggles. So that being said, I have never seen. I mean, you're really starting to see a divergence in terms of people within the oil and gas industry. In terms of, I mean, I mentioned last week, I will have forthcoming podcasts with Carl Rove and Harold Hamm, and Harold Hamm mentioned at the the Oklahoma Petroleum Alliance meeting 2 weekends ago. He mentioned that the oil industry had been really bullish on oil prices, but in the near term, in the next couple of years, they've kind of come around in saying that it's not going to be as bullish. I'm seeing a pretty big divergence with that still right now between operators and service companies in terms of the outlook on that bullish demand. And I think for some service companies, they're still feeling pretty bullish about that. So I do think there's, a tale of two stories for oil right now. And we have to be careful with that. And we also have to be really cognizant of how much production is on the market. So we did see in OPEC production figures that the Saudis had cut output significantly. So that's great. But if they had cut output in under 10 million barrels a day, and they'd had the significant output cut in May, we should have seen some of this material reflected in oil prices, and we haven't. So I have a lot of question marks in terms of what's going on with traders, and whether or not the fundamentals are being baked in here. And then the China side, so there's a lot of aspects of China that we have to cover. One of them is just that the data and the economic data. So we've talked about this before. If you cover anything on China, if you have to do this for a living, you'll realize that it's very hard to get any good data on China. So, but what you do hear overwhelmingly is bad economic data, and the market is not happy with it. So you can't really look at Chinese stocks. Chinese stocks are not a store of value. There's very little, any. I mean, they don't have SEC filings like we do. So you don't have lots of data behind these companies. These could be shells of companies. So if you're trading Chinese stocks or Hong Kong stock, that is a trade. You're not holding these for a store of value. And the zero COVID band-aid was ripped off. Everyone was super excited, overwhelmingly, that China was going to reopen and save the global market and global oil market. And they just haven't seen the recovery. Now this week and previous weeks, we've seen lots of little bits of dabbling from the government, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist government, of saying, hey, we're going to reduce interest rates. We're going to do various things to help incentivize the economy. Unfortunately, a lot of these measures this past week have not lived up to expectations, and the market didn't react as strongly. And part of that's because they have a lot of debt, massive, massive local government debt, and you can't just keep spurring. I mean, how they've got themselves out of these situations before is just spend a lot of money infrastructure spending. Well, you already had this big housing problem, which hasn't been resolved. So what the government did was restrict people from buying housing, put new restrictions up, and make it more difficult, so people weren't buying multiple homes and speculating, and that has reduced home buying. So there's big problems within the system of people not feeling comfortable enough to buy, and I think that's something that's not being well understood, is that the consumer confidence within China just isn't there. So something's off, and that makes sense given that very little data, we get very, very little data out of China, very little data that's not curated and crafted, and increasingly there's tons of laws and restrictions going and being put into place to prevent actual data. The little bit of data that we had before is actually being further restricted. So keep that all in mind when you're thinking about China, and you're thinking about the health of China and what that means for the global economy and what that means for oil prices. Okay, so moving on from oil prices just for a little bit for China, we have to talk about Biden, Blinken, and China. If you didn't know, okay, last weekend, Secretary Blinken went to China, and this was, if you're following any Chinese, if you're following any Chinese podcasts or anything, even sort of the amateur folks or the folks they're covering these, even the guys probably on the left of the spectrum covering China, are pretty negative on the Biden administration for how they've handled this. Because what happened was Biden and Blinken really wanted it. They wanted to resume talks, and Biden has, if you notice, a month or so ago, there was talks about how relationship between China was going to get better. All you hear about on the stock market, if you're watching Bloomberg or CNBC or anything, you hear about this very cold relationship between the U.S. and China, and the high tensions. And even Henry Kissinger just turned 100. He was interviewed on Bloomberg. I listened to that last night. It was actually a really good interview. And at the very end, they really talked about China, and the interviewer asked if he believed that we were on course for war, kinetic war with China. And he said, at the trajectory we're on, yes, he believed there would be war. But he also said that he was, advising both sides to actually talk. So there is an impetus to talk. The problem is that, and the reason the Biden administration is getting criticism, and should, a lot of criticism, is that they didn't get anything out of this. So what China typically does is they criticize the US, and then they basically make the US do things to just talk. So they basically say, you have to do XYZ in order for us to even have a discussion. And then you can come over here and have a discussion. And one of those things that they asked for was that to not release the balloon report. Now, some of that's already been leaked because of the hacking that we saw a few months ago by that young man in the military. So some of that's already been leaked. But a couple issues have come up that are pretty big that the Biden administration keeps deflecting on. And there's some serious stuff. I mean, the Biden administration, they're deflecting on everything, whether it's the Hunter Biden stuff or whether it's Cuba and China. Sounds a little bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the day, or whether it's with China in the balloon report. And so China has basically asked the Biden administration not to release the balloon report, or they would get mad. And so they haven't released it yet. It's probably going to get out there. It's probably going to get leaked. And that yet you have Biden going out there and saying there was 2 trailer loads of equipment on there. And what's been leaked is, we know that there was equipment to basically spying intel equipment. Xi Jinping has denied this, and it's not. I mean, and Biden has said this, that Xi Jinping didn't really know about it. Well, that's really actually pretty embarrassing. If the leader of the Communist Party and also the leader of the military of China does not know about a major spy balloon effort orchestrated this that happens to fly over the U.S. So it doesn't matter. He would have known. He did know. And the fact that Biden is covering for them is a really serious. There's serious implications for that. And then what happened was that so Biden speaks very positively about the meeting that Blinken had in China over the weekend. He wasn't necessarily going to meet Xi Jinping, but he ended up meeting with him. There was lots of talks. So not necessarily moving the needle on anything, but basically just starting talks. So they did that. Biden's bragging about it. He apparently was doing fundraising or campaigning in California, and there was some stuff that came out of that of how positive he was on these Blinken conversations. And that article, so there was an article on Bloomberg from the 19th, June 19th, quote, Biden sees progress with China after Blinken meets with Xi. And it says, U.S. president says his Secretary of State, quote, did a hell of a job. And then says, world's two largest economies look to stabilize relations. This is July 19th. And then it goes in. So he says, Biden responded that he said, quote, I don't feel, it's been made, that progress has been made. So very cocky of a response for just a single meeting. And then he apparently in this meeting in California, he called Xi a dictator, and the response by China was pretty negative. So they came out and had a response to that, and this is a very typical response. As they get, China gets really angry. We don't have the same responses if they call us or somebody a name. We don't do the same response, but they do this. So it's a very classic Chinese maneuvering of basically forcing the Biden administration, pushing them not to release the balloon report, and then getting mad at them if they, on this name front, even while the administration is trying to have relations. And they have not opened up the channels they didn't agree to open up communications on the military side. So that's really concerning and is telling. And there are reasons why, two countries, major military powers, would actually want to have conversations, at least a dialogue. That being said, it really does show that the Biden administration, despite the trade sanctions and everything that they've continued with Trump and the stuff on chips, that they are softening their stance to China, which is a huge problem. And the reason I say that is because, I'm critical of that on many fronts, because I think people are not appreciating how serious this threat of China is. The thing with Cuba is really serious because China has come out and said, the Wall Street Journal and other reports have come out and talked about China having increased relationships with Cuba and looking to enhance military ties with Cuba and having spying and intel capabilities within Cuba. This came out, the Biden administration initially denied it, and then they came out and said, oh, this was going on during the Trump administration. And like many things they've done, they've just deflected and said, well, this was Trump's problem and we inherited it, which is just not what you do. You're president now, so you have to own this situation. So that's really serious because it's very close to the U.S. So when you take the Cuba situation in couple that with the balloon situation and this spying stuff, and then you layer on the TikTok and the ability to pull that information, how much information they can pull on the average U.S. person, and when they're on these apps and everything, collectively there's a lot of data and information there that helps China know as much as they possibly can about the American populace. So that's really concerning, and it's something to keep paying attention to. And it's something that this, the bipartisan stuff on China, I am kind of surprised that we are seeing this sort of softish, more dovish stance on China from the Biden administration. I think the folks who are recommending this is clearly not the right way to go. And there's also some, I take this really seriously, because if you are looking, following the human rights abuses within China, they are directly correlated to autos and to ESG. And to the energy transition. And so Sheffield University, I know I speak about this in presentations and stuff, but it's really important to follow this. Sheffield University has put out some new reports. They're called evidence papers, really great documents, several documents on all this evidence of the human rights abuses, of forced labor abuses within the province of Xinjiang, and really calling out companies and anyone who has supply chain exposure to China, that the only way if you have any supply chain exposure to China, you're at risk of having forced labor in your system, but particularly autos and tomatoes, tomato paste, cotton, all the stuff, and batteries, wind, and solar, which almost exclusively come from the province of Xinjiang. And the response by companies is often, oh my gosh, we can't fix our supply chains, this is too hard. And the reason I criticize the Biden administration on this is because we did implement policies to not be importing stuff from Xinjiang, although those have not been implemented, because we've been taking stuff from Xinjiang, including cotton. And almost all of that, there are direct correlations to cotton picking and forced labor. And so the Chinese government has actually put together strategies and incentives for businesses, especially heavy industry, to move to the province of Xinjiang, and they have very cheap coal, very cheap power, very all these incentives, and they have very very low cost to free to forced labor to supplement these businesses. So there's a huge incentive, and there's meaning behind this, especially if you look through these evidence paper at Sheffield, is that China has experienced rising labor costs, and low labor costs have been one of the big reasons why China has been so attractive for so many businesses. I did think it was also very interesting that if you're looking at the crazy rise in Nvidia and these tech stocks, I mean, Nvidia is trading at 30 times sales right now. Forget earnings; it's 30 times actual sales. But there's been a big flip between, so tons of ESG funds have funneled into Nvidia, and ESG funds were really big on Tesla. And I find that fascinating. Elon Musk is a unique individual in and of himself, but Tesla, is an electric vehicle company. But Tesla just opened a factory, they in Urumqi, or actually, sorry, a showroom in Urumqi, and they do have manufacturing within the province of Xinjiang. Opening up a showroom in Urumqi earlier this year in January was basically a big statement to the Communist Party of saying, "Hey, we're in it with you." And so their supply chains are riddled with supply chain abuse, riddled with human rights abuses, including forced labor or low cost or free and cheap forced labor, and very high. I mean, anything that's, if you're wind and solar, which almost all of China's wind and solar manufacturing is being done in the province of Xinjiang. Almost all of the world's solar or photovoltaics are coming from the province of Xinjiang. So if you're getting the stuff from them, you are getting the actual life cycle emissions. It's horrible. The CO2 footprint is awful, but it is being made most likely with free to forced labor, hence why it's so damn cheap. So really, really important, and to pay attention to. This problem is not going away. It needs to be elevated. It needs to be talked about, and it needs to be understood. And there's really no excuse. So that's all extremely serious. So keep that in your back pocket. And just the point I'm making on that is that the Biden administration has said we're getting imports now increasingly for our solar panels. We're getting them from Malaysia and Vietnam and other countries. They're not making those. They didn't develop supply chain. They didn't develop capacity to make solar panels overnight and make all this stuff. So they're getting it from China, and they're just putting the sticker on it. And the Biden administration, the Congress has said they want to ban that, and the Biden administration has said no, he'd veto that. That's a really, really big problem. That you are, I mean, that's opposite of ESG. That in the name of, we want to have solar panels so bad that we're willing to take them from a direct threat to the U.S., but we're also willing to take them that we know they're made with forced labor and human rights abuses, is just absolutely insane. It needs to be talked about, and it's also a horribly inefficient form of energy. So we need to be cutting off anything exposure from China for solar panels, and wind power as well. And that does push companies to divest out of that area and go to other places. And we're already seeing that take place right now. So if you really want your supply chain, if you really want wind and solar power, which are not very good forms of energy, but if you really want them out of China, when you divest out of these places, companies that want to make money on this, they have to push it elsewhere. And then we start seeing that the cost goes up because it's not actually made. I mean, they have very low cost because it is made with forced labor. So serious consequences that from the whole supply chain perspective. Okay, and lastly, I know that was a long rant on China, had to be done. So home builder sentiment is way up, and this is kind of crazy given that we've seen very high interest rates. But every time interest rates come down a little bit, and interest rates, like what you pay for a mortgage, is not directly tied to what the Fed is doing. It is in terms of the signaling, and then what the 10-year is doing. So it's more directly correlated to the 10-year yield, which is why I talk about that on this podcast and talk about it with clients. So that's real. But what's happening is that every time there's a drop, every time there's a sentiment shift, and we drop mortgage rates, is that the buying goes up. And so buying has just been crazy. And this is the real sticky problem that's going on with the Fed, is that shelter costs are extremely high still. So when you think about inflation overall, and you think about, okay, well, inflation has come down, it's under 5%. That's just the rate of price increases now. So the 10% in food inflation that we had before, we had that, and those prices haven't come down. Just the rate of we're still seeing price increases, and you see that at the grocery store. Think about 2 years ago, what the cost of olive oil was, what the cost of a jar of peanut butter was, what the cost of eggs were. You were paying so much more for report now, and that is really, really problematic. And that's what the Fed is talking about. When Jerome Powell was on the Hill today, he was talking to Congress, and he reiterated the same thing he did with his pause that he just did with the Fed's pause that I've talked about, is that, hey, inflation is still sticky and it's high, and we have to take it down. Why they didn't increase interest rates before is beyond me. It makes no sense. It's created a lot of confusion in the market. And the problem is this: Jerome Powell has a big problem, and he is trying to navigate the political side of this. And unfortunately, it's not working, because the political side has put so much stimulus in the market. So when we have all these government expenditures, which are like $2 trillion a year, that's stimulus that's going to the system, and it's inflationary. The one thing that is going to start helping is that students are going to have to start, student loan payments are going to have to resume within 2 months. That is huge. That is a lot of money that's going to be pulled out of the system. So you can, if you're looking for headwinds potentially in earnings or retail, especially retail, that is it. That's one of them. But that means that the Fed has all these headwinds, and we saw the UK inflation came out at 8.7%. It was this was a couple days ago. It was expected to be 8.4%. That's it, the fact that it's just still near 10% is really high, much higher than ours, but very, very high. And the Bank of England, I mean, we saw the European Central Bank has raised rates. We saw Canada has raised rates unexpectedly. So the fact that the Fed is sort of behind the curve in this and raising rates, and they just want to pause and see what happens and hope everything gets better, it's not going to get better. In fact, it's probably going to make that inflation probably a little more entrenched and stickier. And they say they're going to raise rates, and they're going to have to raise rates at least 2 more times, but they may end up having to raise them higher, because you just have to get rid of this sticky inflation, which they may or may not do, which will be problematic for the economy. But that being said, is that the UK and the EU, or at least the UK, directly talks about government expenditures. And so when you hear commentary about UK inflation and what the government is doing, you hear them talked about together, and you don't hear that in the US, because it's really uncomfortable to talk about, and Jerome Powell doesn't want to talk about, but it's really serious. If the government is spending a lot of money and you are trying to raise interest rates and cool off that spending, the government is not helping you. And so in the UK, they're talking about that they're putting subsidies for mortgage payments, because unlike the US, the rest of the world, their mortgages are basically on 2 year or 5 years. And so when they roll over, they're getting these higher payments. And the government is putting out these incentives to help folks with that, the payments. Well, that's just inflationary, and it's doing the opposite of what the Bank of England is trying to do with raising rates and cooling off the economy. So that's a big problem if we're not addressing that ourselves, and that, hey, the Fed is raising rates, but we still have all this money being spent into the system, and this is real. I mean, entitlement programs, increased government spending, all of this prevents, this keeps people spending, and it's just a simple balancing act. The real thing that no one wants to talk about is unemployment. And that's that unemployment has to rise, because people have to lose jobs to really, really curtail spending, is that they have to feel, a change in the system. And so the Fed is also very uncomfortable talking about that. They talk about, oh, we can have a soft landing, and it won't be recession, but maybe not a big recession. And that we'll go, because the employment sector, because it's so tight right now and it's been so sticky, is that maybe this is good, is that we won't have, instead of having rising unemployment, above 5%, we'll just have the vacancies come off. And the problem is, when you have all these government subsidies still in the system, especially the employee retention tax credit that everyone got, you are going to delay the sort of layoffs that we would see in the regular overall service sector. And the service sector cooling off is going to have to be when the average person, slows down their vacation habits, slows down their driving, slows down their spending and their day-to-day stuff. And that's probably going to become from those job losses. So it's a really, really tricky picture right now, especially for the Fed. And the only tool they have is raising rates and increasing unemployment. And that's very uncomfortable for people. So with that, folks, I know that was long-winded. I appreciate you guys taking a listen and hope you enjoyed it. This is Liberty Energy, Liberty Frac Part 2. This is an awesome conversation with Rory Aune. We get into the nerdy aspects of, the hybrid Digi Prime, what it actually is, when Liberty actually released these, how they released these suite of products, how they're being released right now, and how they actually how they put them into, from idea into fruition. We get into we end the podcast talking about the quiet frac fleet, and how this came, the impetus behind this, and how this came about. So thank you guys so much for listening, and talk to you soon, folks. Bye. If you could walk through from June of 2021 on your Investor Day to now on these suite, where's the movement, where are we thinking, and what is a hybrid Digi Prime?
Yeah, so June of 2021.
Also reminds me of Transformers.
Yeah, so there you go.
Optimus Prime and
yeah, there you go. June of 21, we had our investor day, and we had a quintuplex. It was really our proof of concept first Digi Frac pump, and we took it out. We ran it on diesel generation, and just prove out the concept that this could work. And it's a departure from conventional electric. So most of the electric frac pumps out there have a single big motor hooked onto a pump. Our technology, again, wanting to have kind of redundancy in the system, has 10 electric motors hooked to each pump. So if one electric motor fails, well, turn the other 9 up a little bit. And that was, one of the important features we saw of the technology that we developed. So over the last couple of years, we've commercialized that pump. We've invested in natural gas reciprocating gen sets, and that transition is, I think, kind of interesting, because these are engines that were only approved for basically fixed stationary. They were approved for power generation, they were approved for gas compression, but they weren't approved for non-road mobile.
Right.
And so part of this evolution was getting these engines in to be EPA certified for a non-road mobile application. And it's no small task either.
Absolutely.
It's millions of dollars to do these tests, and the EPA is, they spend a lot of time making sure that what you put out there is meeting the standards that they set out. So that was a hurdle. We've kind of overcome, both of those hurdles, and now we have fleets out there. We have one fleet in West Texas running that is, it's just that we're generating power on site using gas reciprocating engines, and we're consuming it with our electric motors. And so
that's awesome. And that's the real. It's fully functioning the way it was intended to function, or that we've gone down that direction. And when people think of that's it.
Yeah, and it's also exciting because we're electrifying the site with our gensets, and so that has the kind of knock-on effect of being able to electrify everything on site. So we can plug in.
So the access to power is really nice to just have it readily available. And
yeah, so you're already generating power using the most efficient natural gas engines in the world, and you're able to put power up everything from wireline to the frac van to the sand to the blenders. Everything is electrified, and so it really is kind of a holistic approach to providing electricity on site for the entire suite of equipment there. The next iteration of that, what we call Digi Prime, was to take that same family of natural gas engine, and instead of using it to generate electricity and then consuming that electricity with an electric pump, we use it, basically couple it to the transmission like we do with a Tier 4, Tier 2 engine. We couple the engine to the transmission, and it of course drives the pump. And so now we kind of have a traditional frac pump that's got a natural gas engine.
Right.
But the technical challenge of that is these engines weren't designed to take loads quickly. They're designed for electrical generation. And with electrical generation, you can absolutely what you do is you match your demand curve to the ability of the engine to take the load. We didn't have that luxury. When we're at pumping at 12,500 PSI, we want to shift from second to third gear. That happens in a heartbeat. And so that fast transition, we had to develop a system to preload that engine and let it spool up slowly to that level, and then take the load off and introduce it on basically we take it off one side of the crankshaft and introduce it on the other. And so the way we did that was by putting in a generator, hooking a generator to the front of the crankshaft. We've got the transmission and the pump hooked to the back of the crankshaft, and we preload the engine with the generator, and then we shut it off. And so that's the technical, that was the biggest technical hurdle to get these engines.
No, it's brilliant, and it makes a ton of sense, because I think that's the kind of that was a missing component that I think a lot of folks don't understand, is that it just doesn't, you can't just bring all these technologies together, and you guys have solved for that. Is that what you call them, the hybrid Digi Prime?
Yeah.
Okay. And
So-
is that in application?
We are just finishing the first commercial unit right now.
Okay.
The first pump, we had it at the SPE and Frac conference, and we took it back and tore it down and made some changes, and now it's coming back together beyond the test stand here in about 2 weeks. But the nice thing about that is, again, both Digi Prime, our whole Digi suite uses the same high efficiency natural gas recip engine.
Right.
But because we put that generator on the front, we can also electrify the whole site with the Digi Prime suite. So all the Digi suite or Digi fleets can electrify the entire site, and we have kind of I don't know. It's kind of like Tetris. We can fit
Yeah.
the right mix of engines, pumps, and fit them together for our customers' needs.
And I mean, it makes, to me, I mean, from a logistics standpoint, and listening to a ton of other earnings calls, the investments in nat gas are, I mean, they're strong. It doesn't matter who you were listening, a slug of operators and service companies, everybody's leaning pretty hard into nat gas, which makes the, your Siren purchase and then the whole Liberty, the LPI, Liberty Power Innovations, a lot of Liberty names, Liberty Power Innovations, that makes a lot, coupling it all together to make sure you actually have the gas and have that, the feed in there makes a ton of sense. The market, I don't know if they fully appreciate that, because you have so much noise on the energy transition and a lot of stuff against natural gas, especially the stuff that came out of the G7 and the energy communique and everything on nat gas. So I found it very interesting that that communication was coming out from the G7 at the same time these earnings calls were coming out, which were extremely bullish on nat gas. And which is also interesting because, and important for people to realize, is that we have very low natural gas prices. We know we may not always have very low natural gas prices, but we also know how we produce so much of it here that it's not something that's unhedgeable, or it's not something, to me, it doesn't seem unreasonable that you would headlong into nat gas because of how much we produce, how much associated gas we produce, and then obviously the field gas side that, I believe from a technological standpoint, the ability to clean that up quickly and advancements on that is probably, field gas is probably huge. But I was also thinking, a little forward thinking, and this was mentioned a little bit in your earnings call, of the more industrial applications are deploying this, or like if others need your power. If you're producing all this power, it doesn't have to be just for frac. I mean, right? I mean, there's some potential implications for power generation that could be used for other things.
Yeah, once you have these engines non-road mobile certified and mounted on a truck everywhere that needs power, you can just drive over and fire them up, and you can produce. They're about 2.5 megawatts per trailer. So if you need 10 megawatts, you bring in 4 trailers, and you could definitely generate power anywhere.
And I mean, I was just thinking, so the evolution of this, part of it, when I'm thinking of field gas, in places that when we were first drilling, we didn't have a lot of field gas. We had gas production, but not the volumes that you need for something like this. So, you would have been, obviously we were flaring a ton in North Dakota. We still flare in certain parts, but a lot of flaring's been pretty quelled. So this helps on the flaring side if you have field gas. But before, when the business first started 10 years ago, it's not like we had nearly as much gas as we do now. So the whole field gas initiative of, I have this readily available, yes, we have gas here, but I'm still thinking, when you're fracking at some location, that means that in order to get that field gas easily available, people near you have to be producing, and it has to not have a home. So that means that there have to be people actively drilling and completing wells near you, without ample, pipeline infrastructure where they're selling that into market. So that's a whole nerdy market niche of understanding who's doing what where, and where do you have, field gas doesn't have a home.
Well, and it's the quantity of fuel that we use is well, it's significant. So that's the third leg of that. Is it nearby? Is it available? And do you have enough of it? And so when you had tier 2 dual fuel in the early days, or even now with the tier 4 dual fuel, you can say, all right, how much fuel do you have? Oh, we can give you 250,000 standard cubic feet an hour. Okay, well that'll run our entire tier 4 fleet, but that won't run a natural gas, 100% natural gas recent fleet. And so
that's a lot to it. You said 250,000 standard cubic feet. It's a lot of gas.
Yeah, no, and that's where most of the, when we talk about using field gas, it usually is a production line. In some places, you can actually tap a natural gas line and get that, but usually it's a collection from a number of wells where you have
right.
large contiguous acres that they've put in this whole big high pressure gas line to get that gas back to a treatment facility and then treat it and ship it on. So so
you're tapping into that. You're not tapping into this. Otherwise would have been flared.
We can. So it's with dual fuel, with some of the smaller users, where we could just tailor. We'll take whatever you can get.
Right.
But there's just the flare capture just isn't enough gas to run.
Does the Siren purchase help with any of that a little bit? I'm guessing the scale has to be just right, but smaller sort of makeshift solutions on the CNG, it's not next to me, but it's pretty close, and I just need to get that CNG to me.
There's absolutely some places where that works pretty well, or could potentially work pretty well, but again, moving the compressor, getting the compressor powered up, and getting all that logistics, it's way more difficult than it seems like. It should be pretty easy, but when you actually say, okay, well, how do we fill the trailer? Well, we need a compressor. How are we going to power the compressor? Is it electric? Is it, and so the logistics of it become very difficult on flare capture. Now, if you've got, there are some companies that are out there that are saying, hey, we will come in and we'll capture that gas and we'll compress it. And that has a home, but that is raw gas that's untreated.
Okay.
So then we have to treat it. So yeah, it's a challenge.
And it's a scale thing. So with all this evolution, we truly are seeing I think we've seen step changes and massive evolution in the state of the frac business. And I do think it's important for people to understand that electric frac fleet the innovations and the efficiencies and the gains have largely are being driven by efficient use of natural gas on the front end from the power generation, and then all the work on. So it's which you guys have worked on both that and then on the pump side and on the actual frac side. So that's huge. But obviously there's an impetus, and we've talked about this on the CO2 emission side, is that from operators and at least how they talk publicly, and clearly speaking so much about emissions, and everyone knows listening to the podcast, and anyone who knows me, I'm on the record for, I think there's way too much being touted on the emission side and not enough being talked about what the actual operators are doing. But that being said, there has been a big driver, and this is known, by operators pushing for, wanting more electric frac fleets for emissions reduction. And what I thought was interesting about this paper was the explanation on really going through what's your biggest bang for your buck on reducing CO2 emissions. And so I would like for you to sort of walk us through that if it's about CO2 emissions reduction, you guys obviously have a suite of products that are working within that, but how much have you, from the old stuff to what you're doing now, what's the actual reduction? And if this is about emissions reduction, is great, but it's that, hey, we also it has to be efficient. And so to me, when when things make sense, it's usually a fuel efficiency standpoint and a cost efficiency standpoint and a technological advancements. And, oh, by the way, and because of that, we're reducing all these CO2 emissions because we're using less fuel or we're using that fuel better.
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there, but let's
take any angle you want on that.
Okay, well, I think it'd be worth talking about the actual savings because they are important to talk about. So when you look at going from because 2/3 of our fleets are diesel, you really think about these in a replacement mode would replace a diesel fleet. We would keep those dual fuel fleets running until the very last diesel fleet was replaced. And so when you take a diesel fleet and you replace it with 100% natural gas, you're talking on order, depending on the price of diesel and gas and everything else, but the savings could be 15, 20 million a year per fleet.
Yeah, that's huge.
And so it provides a great basis to start replacing these because you can pay for that investment fairly quickly. So that's the economic driver here. Now, if you talk about what happens to ESG, well, when we went from tier 2, we moved to tier 4, like we talked about, we basically were flat on CO2 emissions. So it's CO2e emissions, so CO2 equivalent, which would include on the dual fuel side any methane that was leaked through the engine.
Right.
So,
which you guys when they do CO2e, I really like that because you use the EPA standard for 25 times the methane being 25 times more than CO2.
Right.
So your CO2e is inclusive in encapsulating the methane side, which I think is extremely transparent.
Yeah, so we got, we went from tier 2 to tier 4. We got a tremendous reduction in particulates. We got, 10-fold reduction in NOx. But really, because of everything we talked about, we were really flat on CO2e. There was no reduction, it was more or less flat. Now going from a tier 4 dual fuel, when we stepped from there to a natural gas recip, so a tier 4 engine diesel dual fuel, we'll call it around 35% thermally efficient. When you step up to a natural gas recip that we're using, that engine natively is about 45% thermally efficient. And it doesn't, 10%. That 10% really equates to about a 30% reduction in CO2e. Or if you want to look at it, about a 30% reduction in fuel consumption, because really how much fuel you burn is just how much CO2 you put out. And fuel equals CO2, and then methane. The methane slip on these new recips is extremely low. So the CO2 reduction, really moving from tier 4 to gas recip, it's the jackpot. You get both a significant reduction in CO2. Your NOx is really flat. It's less than a gram per kilowatt hour on tier 4. It's less than a gram per kilowatt hour on. And
that's when when we think about tier 4, you are able to reduce the CO2 when you're pushing as much nat gas in as possible, right? It's 70-30 on nat gas versus diesel. You're still dropping your CO2, but not to the equivalent of when you're going to your recip, your nat gas engines. That's 100% nat gas. So you're taking all that 30% out, and that's where the massive CO2e reduction comes in.
No, the massive CO2 reduction comes in the incredible efficiency of the engine.
Okay.
So that's where all of that comes from, really. It's just that the engine is so wildly more efficient. It just burns a lot less fuel. The fuel that it's burning has a lot less carbon in it. So ergo, we get this dual reduction. And then on the particulate side, we get another massive decrease in particulates because burning natural gas really doesn't produce much of any particulates. So
I think. Are we going to see more applications to that? We were kind of hinting. I was hinting at that before, but will we see more applications so that wildly efficient use of nat gas on the front of that and those engines on the front end to drive this? I mean, we because it's that much more efficient on the fuel side. Are there applications outside of frac that we're going to see this?
Oh yeah, I think you're already seeing it. There's definitely shipbuilders that are using natural gas engines. One of the engines that we looked at when I was in Germany a few months ago was designed for a locomotive. And if you think about how a locomotive, one of the things about any mobile application, you have to drag your fuel with you, or you have to park and bring the fuel, LPI style, bring it in a trailer.
Right.
If you've got a rail line and you can use a natural gas engine, you could hook up a couple of LNG cars behind
Right.
the locomotive and pull your fuel with you, and the locomotive would barely notice that additional tonnage. So yeah, I think there's a decent runway ahead for this type of technology. I do.
And it seems like it, and I dabbled in when rail was big, crude by rail was big, and there was talk then. This was several years ago, but I think the engines had not the technology just wasn't there yet. And now I would say that it makes me think of on the shipping side and the rail side, when you have step changes and advancements on that much more efficiency and that much less fuel. That's really where the application of this you could see big places where this can be used, and dramatically it could have dramatic impacts in diesel usage.
Yeah, for our Liberty Power Innovations business, we ordered 15 natural gas tractors. So these are Kenworth tractors that have the 100% natural gas reciprocating engine in place of the diesel engine, and so they have compressed natural gas tanks on board, and
How new are those? Did those just come out? Like
they've been around a bit. They've probably been a little bit underpowered. They're making a change on the engine side to fix that. But yeah, these are our first 15. We'll take delivery of this year.
Oh, awesome! That's a nice little nerdy tidbit. Anything else? Any more on this? Anything else you want to add on this emission stuff?
I don't know if there's much more to add. I think if I were to look just my perception over the last 5 years, there's absolutely our customers are taking it very seriously, and so that is driving a change in the industry, and they want the latest, greatest equipment. I think it's really, we talk a lot about the barriers to entry in businesses like Frac. You go back to 2012, 2013, if you could get hold of some used frac pumps, rebuild the engines, you had a company.
Yep.
And really today, there's still a little bit of there is a little bit of the market out there that is looking for just what's the very cheapest job you can give me. Really, the trend though is towards we want both the most efficient, cheapest from a fuel standpoint frac fleet you can provide, and it has to be lower emissions. It must.
Well, and that's where I think the evolution of the industry sort of gets you to that point of, I always think it is tricky on the frac side. I know you guys as a company have been known for, and Chris mentions the earnings call a lot of, your customers are pretty consistent. It's not that they're not going, you're not flipping out all the time with customers. So it's a long-term relationship base. And that makes a big difference, but it also is a big difference when companies are consolidating and smaller companies, well, particularly here in Colorado, Chevron just bought PDC. And they weren't a small company by any means, but that consolidation also breeds, if these big public companies, for right or wrong, are pushing on the emission standpoint. I personally think some of that's wrong, but it is what they're demanding. Now, the question is whether they pay for it. And I think it sounds like, the state of the industry, we're at a point where the service sector is finally, in a comfortable position, and I think that we're in an interesting time though, where the the industry is at a comfortable position. The service sector is at a comfortable position, but the industry, we're $71 oil. And we still have all this, we still have a lot of, I don't want to say pent-up demand, but we don't have people just ending their... Okay, so apologies for technical difficulties, but we were talking about, and we're going to wrap up this podcast, and we were talking about the consolidation in the space, right? We have an evolution. We're more than 10 years now into the business. Shale revolution really started 2006 with gas, 2008 with oil, and it's now 2023. So naturally, the industry has evolved. Frac has evolved with that, but also operators. We have big consolidation on the public side. Publics have tons of cash right now. They may or may not be entering a period of M&A, big M&A, and buying up these smaller companies. This is happening in Colorado, so with Chevron buying PDC. And so that means a few different things. But to your point on the emission standpoint and what operators are asking for, these big publics, they're definitely asking for this, right? They want they want to put this in their books. Now, personally, I think it's not enough to move the needle in the world. Like Colorado is 0.3% of global emissions. So if if we dropped if everyone was using an electric frac fleet at the primo usage and we dropped all the emissions we could, it's just very little in terms of the actual output. Not saying that companies doing that's a bad thing, but I do think it's important that we think about $71 oil and this consolidation. And yes, lots of big publics have lots of cash. We still, though, as you guys know, in the Permian, and you work with a lot of private companies, is that there's a lot of private companies, and they tend to they flex down when oil prices go down, they flex up when oil prices go up, and they also contribute meaningfully to adding production. And the publics are not meaningfully adding to production; they're keeping things within. They're making money and returning money to shareholders, and they're growing at 3 to 5%. And I think Chris, you guys mentioned in your earnings call that we're basically at maintenance. 250-ish frac fleets is sort of maintenance mode for U.S. oil production, which to me, if we say 12.5 million barrels a day, that's a pretty good number. I think we could actually grow, but we're at sort of maintenance. But I do think there's implications for, okay, the businesses, this is a trajectory of the business. They want this from the frac side. They want this from everyone. They want lower emissions. But you guys have to be able to make money on it. And this has to ride the course of, it's a commodity business. So there's great benefits with nat gas prices being low. That helps actually with oil prices going lower. But if oil prices go to 50, and however long they would go, let's just pretend, because we have seen 50 before. If oil prices go to 50, and I think we're just getting a little bit caught up in the industry that we're going to be. I think we think like it's 100 and it's 70, but we still, everybody in the industry talks like it's 100 and it's not, it's 70. But we have this pretty remarkable resiliency. And I babble a little bit on the market side, but I'd love for your take on that. You may disagree with that, which is completely fine.
No, the market side, I think you nailed it. One of the things that maybe to add to that is, 250 frac fleets is kind of maintenance level if we just kind of maintain there. But the wells that we drill today are producing a little bit less than the wells we drilled yesterday. And so the number of wells we have to complete year on year to maintain 12, 13 million barrels a day is going to increase. So the amount of, even if we just holding production constant, we need to see a remarkable increase across the industry in efficiency, or we need more frac fleets. And those frac fleets, what is in demand because of the potential for a shift down in the price of oil, or just capture the savings that you can get from 100% natural gas. So they want, like I said, it's both. They want both. Yep. They want cheaper, and they want it better. And
I do think it's a really good point. Because I push the emissions too hard, but I do think 100% natural gas at these gas prices, knowing we're gross withdrawals are 123 billion cubic feet per day, we have a lot of natural gas. So it makes total sense. And I really do hope the industry, being third generation and spending my life studying it, I really do hope the industry this time around, and thus far, that no one's put the brakes on. At $70 oil, you shouldn't be putting the brakes on. But, this is if you haven't learned the lesson yet, write it out, drill through it, complete through it, like work through it, because you can do the math all day long, and your books look better when you drill and complete through the downturn than when you don't and you just stop, and it screws everyone up, and then everybody pushes you to drop prices, and then they don't wait, and then you have to raise them, and it's a mess. And the industry needs to be very forward thinking in this run, and as much as consolidation as we still have so many of these privates, which have helped keep those well completions up. And I think to your point of we have to continue those efficiency gains, and we have to maintain. And this industry has been very good at that, of being extremely progressive. I mean, the average lateral lengths we drill, I always talk about that, but I mean, it's way more than it was. It's incrementally grows every quarter. So we're looking at those efficiencies, but we are completing less wells in total than we were, which makes sense why we're not at 13 million barrels a day, because we're not completing as many wells as we were prior. The average productivity is holding up pretty well. I mean, it hasn't been smashed, so I find that very impressive, because we have so many privates that have sort of stepped out, and so I always tell people I'm pretty bullish on the rock, and I know you guys. This is why I love completions. I mean, you guys are bullish on the rock too. The rock has a lot left to give, so I do think, like, I hope people listening to this really appreciate that. This is one. It's an incredibly fascinating business. It's hugely technically. I mean, there's a massive amount of technology that's in this. It's extremely nerdy, but it also has a lot of running room. And just the stuff that you've done alone within Liberty, I think, is extremely impressive. But it's not like it's just not a boring business by any means. Yeah.
Yes, it's absolutely never been boring. Yeah, for sure.
And lastly, I will just mention, because you pioneered the quiet frac fleet here in Colorado, and this is probably not the podcast to talk about, Colorado regulations. I talked about it plenty on previous podcasts, but it is a different environment to work in, and it was an impetus for you developing the quiet frac fleet, correct? To make, because in Colorado you drill closer to urban environments, and so I've had Heidi Gill on the podcast with Urban Solutions on the actual sound walls, but the quiet frac fleet is literally obviously has more applications than just Colorado, but that was all you, right?
Well, yeah, I wish it was all me, but yeah, it was let's say it was my idea. So going back to kind of 2015 and 2014, 2014, we were coming out of 2014, we started the downturn, and at the very same time, Colorado decided that, they promulgated a rule that said we have to maintain emissions or basically sound pressures at less than 65 dBc at the nearest inhabited structure, which there's a 500-foot setback here in Colorado, so the nearest inhabited structure would be roughly 500 feet away. So your fleet has to be less than 65 dBc at 500 feet. So that's where we started, and it was. I think it's fair to say that we didn't think that was going to be possible, but I in a previous life worked in underground mining for many years, and that was something that we worked hard on in underground mining, because you're going down these tunnels, you have miners driving these big loaders, and the sound bounces off the rock just maybe a foot or two away and bounces right, and so it's the intensity of the sound was so high, and so we had to make improvements to this underground equipment to get in compliance with MSHA. Well, fast forward 15, 20 years, here we are in Colorado, and we said, well, we've got to make these frac fleets quieter, and everybody said, well, they're loud. And actually there was a certain amount of people that, when I said I think we can make them quieter, they were proud of how loud they were. Like, that loudness meant power, and it meant America, and so I said, well, nonetheless,
it's not going to be silent, and it's just quieter. Yeah,
exactly. And so I went out here. We have a great fab shop. We have a bunch of really innovative guys out here in the fab shop, and I said, let's start looking at what we could do to make this thing quieter. And we tried a couple things, did a proof of concept, and kind of showed it to Chris and the rest of the executive team. Said, hey, I think we could do this. So we built the funny anecdote that we built an actual prototype, and with everything we had learned from our work here in Colorado, we went down to Oklahoma and we built a prototype and we fired it up. And the reduction of noise at, when we say 65 dBc, really it's the low frequency noise that travels really efficiently across space. And so what you want to do, if you could do something perfect in a perfect world, you would knock out all those really low frequencies, so 20 hertz to maybe up to 200 or 300 hertz. Knock those out, and the rest would kind of naturally dissipate because they're not long lived in the atmosphere. Well, we finished this very first prototype, and we put it on the test stand, and I measure it, and we made it louder. Like we effectively built a giant subwoofer. The walls of the enclosure were acting like a speaker and amplifying the low frequency. And I was like, all right, we can't make this call. I can't call Chris Wright and tell him, hey, good news, we made it worse. No. So back to the drawing board. We brought in a gentleman that had worked at NASA, had been on one of the shuttle programs, and was kind of an expert in reducing noise. And he said, well, you got it 99%. It's just this one thing that you missed. And so he was able to tweak it. And yeah, what a success story for us. I mean, we took we saw kind of a 3 to 4x reduction in sound power. We were kind of 103 decibels at 25 feet, and prior to enclosing them, and after we're at about 80. So it's a remarkable, it exceeded my expectations, and it was kind of just in time. We rolled out these fleets as Colorado got very serious about enforcing these noise restrictions, and we of course we saw one of the drillers here locally got shut down for being too loud. And so it was a good idea, some great work by a lot of engineers here at Liberty, and then and elsewhere, and then great timing for rolling it out.
So I think it's a good example of the sheer technology, and I was sort of giving props to you because you did lead it, but obviously there were a lot of other incredible people at Liberty working on it. But I think it's one of those things that should be an illustration to folks of the incredible technology, and the fact that you're getting NASA engineers to work on this. Of that, this is not a boring business. It's a very technologically competent business, and evolves, and that it is a constant state of evolution. And that also, when the industry gets pushed to do something, they generally respond. You're told to do something, and you do it, and it works. But I think the quiet frac fleet, I've unfortunately or fortunately never been on a non-quiet frac fleet. So all the frac tours I've been on have been Liberties, and they are you can hear. It's not like it's completely silent, but you can hear people. And I think from just a safety standpoint and just a communication standpoint, there's a lot of benefits to that for various reasons. So, yes, reducing noise, but I think in an application basis, I can imagine, folks outside of the DJ saying it wouldn't be bad to have a quiet frac fleet. So I think from that standpoint, and the fact that you guys did it just in time and had it to comply is just a complete example of this industry is filled with remarkable people in engineering feats. So if there's requirements, and this is why I'm big on the regulatory side of saying lay them out and then let's go hit them. But if the regulatory environment is pushed to where the goal is to put the industry out of business, that's very different. And I just think that's an important differentiating piece, but a very great technological feat.
Yeah, it is. And we were also, I have to mention that we're incredibly lucky to develop this technology and it was millions of dollars in development. To develop it in 2015 in just one of the worst environments to try to beg for money to do a capital project. I remember I said, Chris, our CEO Chris Wright, I said, hey Chris, I think this is a good idea. I think we should do it. And he said, no, it's a great idea. And I said, it's going to cost millions of dollars, and I think it's going to work. There's no guarantee. And well, let's go do it. And he was just 100% big believer in this. And what's been interesting is, I even had, as we were developing it and as it was proving out, I had some conversations with people, and they said, we don't need that. Like, it's not, we won't need it. We'll figure something else out. Don't worry about it. And it came out, and it all of a sudden we went from 0 quiet fleets in the DJ basin to virtually every fleet running in this basin is either one of our quiet fleets or a facsimile thereof. But what's then interesting is how, like you mentioned, then other places started hearing about it. Said, we need this in Midland. We are fracking right here. We need one of those too. Give us one of those fleets. And then, in Louisiana, yes, we also need that.
Right. So, like the ones I was thinking about this, because when I was seeing in Midland, I say this all the time, but like go down to Midland and just look out the window, but drive around town, because you will see rigs like right, not in the center of town, but they're certainly in town, and they've got sound walls up, just like you would see here with, I don't know if those Urban Solutions, whoever, sound walls, but they're sound walls up. I imagine when they're fracking that, after they're done drilling, they will probably want a quiet fleet, because they've got people right around them. I mean, you have pump jacks in people's yards, but the fact that you're actively drilling and completing wells, like with businesses and houses around you, I would absolutely imagine. That's not everywhere, because a lot of the stuff, as we talked about, is kind of out there. But even then, if you had a lot of stuff going on and simul ops and everything, like lots of activity and different stuff, I could imagine there still might be an incentive for a quiet fleet.
Oh yeah, and we're definitely seeing it. We're seeing them pull that technology out of Colorado, and we've been I've been excited to see it move into Texas, move into Louisiana. But I guess my point there was, you need an executive team that it's not enough just to have a good idea.
Yep.
You need a leadership team that can say, I can see where you're going. I see the vision. And if you build a better mousetrap, other people start, they want one of those too. And I think we will see that same sort of innovation or that same pull now with 100% natural gas. I think that's
absolutely.
It was hard to develop it. It took a lot of work. We had to do, the EPA certification, all of the steps that had happened. Now most of those are in the rear view, and now I think we're right at the front end of that technology kind of really taking over a significant portion of frac. Whether it's like Digi Frac or eFrac or this, like what we call our Digi Prime or hybrid solution, 100% natural gas. I really think is the future.
Well, I think that's a really good note to close on, and thinking nat gas future. I also think it's really good to point out that I think the way that that's marketed, I think, by the street, or how banks and analysts, or if you're listening to Bloomberg or CNBC or reading the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal, they call that electric. And I do think it's important that, I think you guys do a good job, but other folks in the industry have to do this too. It is natural gas, and the reason you have to articulate that is because that people have to be able to invest in that, right? You have to have all these parties, and that's why I'm so incredibly serious about getting public companies, more public companies like yourselves to be honest about this stuff. But there isn't an earnings call you could listen to last quarter that wasn't leaning in on nat gas. So you're 100% right. I mean, this, and I even think that would have been the case whether nat gas prices were $2, two and change, because these investments and this thinking came long before they were actually happening well into nat gas being $6.50 on average last year and $10 in August last year. So this was going on long before, and this is the whole, to me, where I get excited about, at least you guys and some others, looking long into the business of that. This is a commodity business. It is a boom and bust business, and we have cycles. And if you can look through them, there's huge opportunities. And I think we're obviously going into recession, and things are going to be messy, but there's also huge opportunities in that. So, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Roy.
Thank you, Trisha. Appreciate it.
Awesome.